Classical conditioning helps explain such diverse phenomena as crying at the sight of a bride walking down the aisle, fearing the dark, and falling in love. Classical conditioning is one of a number of different types of learning that psychologists have identified, but a general definition encompasses them all, and that is learning. So, learning in itself is a relatively permanent change in behavior that is brought about by experience. By learning, we humans adapt to our environment. We learn to expect and prepare for significant events, such as food or pain, and that's classical conditioning. We learn to repeat acts that bring rewards and avoid acts that brings unwanted results. That's operant conditioning. We learn new behaviors by observing events and people. And through language, we learn things we have neither experienced nor observed. That's cognitive learning. But how do we learn? How do we know when a behavior has been influenced by learning, or even as a result of learning? Part of the answer relates to the nature-nurture question, one of the fundamental issues underlying the field of psychology. In the acquisition of behaviors, experience, which is essential to the definition of learning, is the nature part of the nature-nurture question. However, it's not always easy to identify whether a change in behavior is due to nature or nurture, because some changes in behavior or performance come about through maturation alone and don't involve experience. For instance, children become better tennis players as they grow older, partly because their strength increases with their size, a maturational phenomenon. To understand when learning has occurred, we must differentiate maturational changes from improvements resulting from practice, which indicate that learning actually has occurred. Similarly, short-term changes in behavior that are due to factors other than learning, such as declines in performance resulting from fatigue or lack of effort, are different from performance changes that are due to actual learning. If Serena Williams has a bad day on the tennis court because of tension or fatigue, this does not mean that she has not learned to play correctly or has unlearned how to play well. Because there is not always a one-to-one correspondence between learning and performance, understanding when true learning has occurred is difficult. It is clear that we are primed for learning from the beginning of life. Infants exhibit a simple type of learning called habituation, which is the decrease in response to a stimulus that occurs after repeated representations of the same stimulus. For example, young infants may initially show interest in a novel stimulus, such as brightly colored toys, but they will soon lose interest if they see the same toy over and over again. Habituation permits us to ignore things that have stopped providing new information. Most learning is considerably more complex than habituation, and the study of learning has been at the core of the field of psychology. Although philosophers since the time of Aristotle have speculated on the foundations of learning, the first systematic research on learning was done at the beginning of the 20th century when Ivan Pavlov developed the framework for learning called classical conditioning. So, Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian psychologist, never intended to do psychological research. In fact, in 1904, he won the Nobel Prize for his work on digestion. Yet, Pavlov is remembered not for his physiological research, but for his experiments on basic learning processes, work that began quite accidentally. Pavlov had been studying the secretion of stomach acids and salivation in dogs. While doing that, he observed a curious phenomenon. Sometimes stomach secretions and salivation would begin in the dogs when they had not even eaten yet. The mere sight of the experimenter who normally brought the food, or even the sound of the experimenter's footsteps, was enough to produce salivation in the dogs. He saw that the dogs were responding not only on the basis of the biological need, which is hunger, but also as a result of learning, or as it came to be called, classical conditioning. So, a dog does not learn to salivate in response to food in its mouth. Rather, food in the mouth automatically, unconditionally triggers the dog's salivation reflex. Thus, Pavlov called this drooling an unconditioned response, and he called the food an unconditioned stimulus. Salivation in response to a tone, however, is learned. It is conditional upon the dogs associating the tone with the food. Thus, we call this response the conditioned response. Although the terminology Pavlov used to describe classical conditioning may seem confusing, the following summary can help make the relationship between stimuli and responses easier to understand and remember. So just remember, conditioned equals learned. Unconditioned equals unlearned. The unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response parents are not learned and not trained. They are naturally occurring. During conditioning, a previously neutral stimulus is transformed into the conditioned stimulus. A conditioned stimulus leads to a conditioned response, and a conditioned stimulus conditioned response pairing is a consequence of learning and training. An unconditioned response and a conditioned response are similar, such as salivation in Pavlov's experiment, but the unconditioned response occurs naturally, whereas the conditioned response is learned. So, just to recap on this section, what is learning? Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior resulting from experience. And how do we learn to form associations between stimuli and responses? One major form of learning is classical conditioning, which occurs when a natural stimulus, one that normally brings about no relevant response, is repeatedly paired with a stimulus, which is called an unconditioned response, that brings about a natural, untrained response. Now, Conditioning occurs when the neutral stimulus is repeatedly presented just before the unconditioned stimulus. After repeated pairings, the neutral stimulus elicits the same response that the unconditioned stimulus brings about. When this occurs, the neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, and the response is a conditioned response. Learning is not always permanent. Extinction occurs when a previously learned response decreases in frequency and eventually disappears. Stimulus generalization is the tendency for a conditioned response to follow a stimulus that is similar to, but not the same as, the original conditioned stimulus. The converse phenomena, stimulus discrimination, occurs when an organism learns to distinguish between stimuli. Now, let us move on to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is the basis for many of the most important kinds of human and animal learning. Operant conditioning is learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or weakened depending on its favorable or unfavorable consequences. When we say that a response has been strengthened or weakened, it has been made more or less likely to recur regularly. Unlike classical conditioning, in which the original behaviors are the neutral biological responses to the presence of a stimulus such as food, water, or pain, operant conditioning applies to voluntary responses which an organism performs deliberately to produce a desired outcome. The term operant emphasizes this point. The organism operates on its environment to produce a desirable result. Thorndike's early research served as the foundation of the work of one of the 20th century's most influential psychologists, B.F. Skinner. You may have heard of the Skinner box, a chamber with a highly controlled environment that was used to study operant conditioning processes with laboratory animals. So, using Thorndike's law of effect as a starting point, Skinner developed a behavioral technology that revealed the principles of behavior control. By shaping pigeons' natural walking and pecking behaviors, for example, Skinner was able to teach them such unpigeon-like behaviors as walking, playing ping pong, and keeping a missile on course by pecking at a screen target. For his pioneering studies, Skinner designed an operant chamber, popularly known as a Skinner box. The box was a bar level that an animal presses, or a key disc the animal pecks, to relate a reward of food or water. So, what is the role of reward and punishment in learning? Well, in operant conditioning, it is a form of learning in which a voluntary behavior is strengthened or weakened. According to B.F. Skinner, the major mechanism underlying learning is reinforcement, the process by which a stimulus increases the probability that a preceding behavior will be repeated. Primary reinforcers are rewards that are naturally effective without previous experience because they satisfy a biological need. But secondary reinforcers begin to act as if they were primary reinforcers through association with a primary reinforcer. So again, a primary reinforcer satisfies some biological need and works naturally regardless of a person's previous experience. Food for a hungry person, warmth for a cold person, and relief for a person in pain all would be classified as primary reinforcers. Now, a secondary reinforcer, in contrast, is a stimulus that becomes reinforcing because of its association with a primary reinforcer. For instance, we know that money is valuable because we have learned that it allows us to obtain other desirable objects, including primary reinforcers such as food and shelter. Money thus becomes a secondary reinforcer. Positive reinforcers are stimuli that are added to the environment and lead to an increase in a preceding response. And negative reinforcers are stimuli that remove something unpleasant from the environment, also leading to an increase in the preceding response. So let us unpack this a little bit more in depth. A positive reinforcer is a stimulus added to the environment that brings about an increase in a preceding response. If food, water, money, or praise is provided after a response, it is more likely that the response will occur again. The paychecks that workers get at the end of a week, for example, increase the likelihood that they will return to their jobs the following week. In contrast, a negative reinforcer refers to an unpleasant stimulus whose removal leads to an increase in the probability of a preceding response will be repeated in the future. For example, if you have an itchy rash, which is an unpleasant stimulus that is relieved when you apply a certain brand of ointment, you are more likely to use that ointment the next time you have an itchy rash. Using the ointment then is negatively reinforcing because it removes the unpleasant itch. Similarly, if your iPod volume is so loud that it hurts your ears when you first turn it on, you are likely to reduce the volume. Lowering the volume is negatively reinforcing, and you are more apt to repeat the action in the future when you first turn it on. Negative reinforcement then teaches the individual that taking an action removes a negative condition that exists in the environment. Like positive reinforcers, negative reinforcers increase the likelihood that preceding behaviors will be repeated. Please note, negative reinforcement is not the same thing as punishment. Punishment refers to a stimulus that decreases the probability that a prior behavior will occur again. Unlike negative reinforcement, which produces an increase in behavior, punishment reduces the likelihood of a prior response. If we receive a shock that is meant to decrease a certain behavior, then we are receiving punishment. But if we are already receiving a shock and do something to stop that shock, the behavior that stops the shock is considered to be negatively reinforced. In the first case, a specific behavior is apt to decrease because of the punishment. In the second, it is likely to increase because of the negative reinforcement. So, there are two types of punishment: positive punishment and negative punishment. Just as there are positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. In both cases, positive means adding something and negative means removing something. So, positive punishment weakens a response through the application of an unpleasant stimulus. In contrast, negative punishment consists of the removal of something pleasant. For instance, when a teenager is told she is grounded and will no longer be able to use the family car because of her poor grades, or when an employee is informed that he has been demoted with a cut in pay because of poor job performance, negative punishment is being administered. Both positive and negative punishment result in a decrease in the likelihood that a prior behavior will be repeated. The following rules can help you distinguish these concepts from one another. Reinforcement increases the frequency of the behavior preceding it, and punishment decreases the frequency of the behavior preceding it. The application of a positive stimulus brings about an increase in the frequency of behavior and is referred to as positive reinforcement. The application of a negative stimulus decreases or reduces the frequency of behavior and is called punishment. The removal of a negative stimulus that results in an increase in the frequency of behavior is negative reinforcement. The removal of a positive stimulus that decreases the frequency of behavior is negative punishment. So remember, punishment decreases the probability that a prior behavior will occur. Positive punishment weakens a response through the application of an unpleasant stimulus, whereas negative punishment weakens a response by the removal of something positive. In contrast to reinforcement, in which the goal is to increase the incidence of behavior, punishment is meant to decrease or suppress behavior. Schedules and patterns of reinforcement affect the strength of duration of learning. Generally, partly reinforcement schedules, in which reinforcers are not delivered on every trial. It produces stronger and longer lasting learning than do continuous reinforcement schedules. Among the major categories of reinforcement schedules are fixed and variable ratio schedules, which are based on the number of responses made. The fixed and variable interval schedules, which are based on the time interval that lapses before reinforcement is provided. Now, stimulus control training, which is similar to stimulus discrimination in classical conditioning, is reinforcement of a behavior in which the presence of a specific stimulus, but not in its absence. In stimulus generalization, an organism learns a response to one stimulus and then exhibits the same response to slightly different stimuli. Shaping is a process for teaching complex behaviors by rewarding closer and closer approximations of the desired final behavior. There are biological constraints or built-in limitations on the ability of an organism to learn. Certain behaviors will be relatively easy for individuals of a species to learn, whereas other behaviors will be either difficult or impossible for them to learn. And one more thing. Behavior modification is a method for formally using the principles of learning theory to promote the frequency of desired behaviors and to decrease or eliminate unwanted behaviors.